So here are the Lit Talk girls today, and what we're going to be bringing to you today is some tips and some advice and education on the process of selling when you're going through a divorce. So with the statistics sitting in 1 out of 2 are getting divorced, we really want to share with you some of our experiences and how you can go through that process and how we might be able to assist you with that. So, with Nicole and how we've discussed previously, the statistics that you have on your sales, talk us through how divorcing impacts you and how it impacts the seller.
Yes, Meg. Well, sometimes selling is not always a something that you a choice. Yes, sometimes it's a forced sale.
Yeah.
So really, there's 3 reasons that we go through the sale of a property. So sometimes it could be divorce, it could be death, or you're moving. It's really those 3 things that we focus on. So today we'll be touching on divorce, and it is quite a sensitive issue because I would say at least 60% of my vendors experience going through a divorce. And while they're in love and purchase their first home together and everything's going smoothly, sometimes things don't pan out and their biggest asset is their property and we need to sell that for them. So we have to be sensitive to how we handle that sales process and talk them through it with experts. Someone like Marie certainly is experienced at that, and that is somebody we would recommend if we are asked what the steps are or how do we go about it.
So when clients or vendors keep that kind of information from you, because I know that's happened when I've been staging a property and the agent hasn't been engaged necessarily, or they have, when that's the case, how does that affect the sales process? Because, you know, I hear all the time, oh, we don't want to tell the agent that we're getting divorced because that means they're just going to get rid of our property for nothing. You know, but that's not what we're trying to do, but they think that. So how does that affect you when they don't share that information?
Look, I think quite often it's building trust with the vendor that you're dealing with, and obviously explaining to them that everything they discuss with you is confidential. And if they're in a situation where both parties are possibly not speaking to each other, I certainly give them information like we could meet separately, we don't all have to meet together, but when both of them are on the title and I require both their signatures, it's important we're on the same page. So I try my best up front to let them know I'm on their side, I'm not against them.
Yeah.
I'm here to assist them with the process and ensure that we still get the highest possible price for both of them.
Yeah. But how does it actually affect them? So if they don't give that information to you, what sort of impact does that have on the actual sales process itself? You know, they're not communicating with each other. A buyer comes to the table. What impacts that seller?
Well, it can certainly affect the ultimate price on the property because if I can't get them to agree or I can't gain access to the property, that can make it more difficult to put a deal together. So up front, I try and discuss all the pros and cons as to why we need to be on the same page. And I have had instances whereby one party is very motivated, they want to sell, the other one doesn't want to sell, and it will affect our bottom line. Or I've had instances where both parties have agreed, and when we come to signing the contract, there's a change of heart. So it can make it difficult because one party doesn't want to sell, and that's why someone like Marie and her expertise, she can certainly step in and assist from the beginning of the process.
So when is actually the right time for a lawyer to be involved? Like what's the right time?
The right time is really, I mean, you should really get legal advice before you separate.
Yes.
In an ideal world, that would be great. Sometimes we don't have control over that, and the other person may make the decision to end the relationship. So either before separation or alternatively straight after you have separated.
So sorry, Marie. So why do they have to do that? What's the advantages to them?
People need to get advice about what their entitlements are when it comes to property. So are you entitled to 60% of the property pool? Does that include just the house? Does it include the superannuation? And it impacts the parties because they're obviously dealing with the real estate agent, negotiating sales prices and those types of things, and the strategy when it comes to the sale process. If they haven't had that advice, then they may not know exactly what they need in terms of a sale price to be able to establish a list price. So to give you an example, I had a client where they hadn't come to see me. They had decided, with the agent's advice, to list a property at $800,000. Later, I heard that the real estate agent had actually advised them to list it slightly less, but they obviously wanted the most money that they could because they were splitting it between the two of them. So they didn't really go with the agent's advice. They listed the property. They also decided to auction the property, but they didn't have any agreement about what would happen if there was no buyer, if it got passed in. What would be the process after that? Would they need to keep negotiating? What was their bottom line? They didn't have any of that information to hand because they hadn't received that legal advice. And so in this instance, the property sold for, or got passed in, I think the highest bid at the time was $690,000, which was substantially less than the $800,000. And so then that put a spanner in the works. The husband and wife thought they had reached agreement between themselves. He was going to get $600,000, she was going to get $200,000, and for various reasons. But then ultimately the whole deal that they had made together fell over, and then the real estate agent obviously was impacted with that, and the wholesale process was impacted. So it was really important for these people to get that advice from the start, because then they had to start at square one. And Nicole, auctioning is quite an expensive process, so you can just imagine how much money they put down the toilet just doing that.
And that's also quite a stressful situation for them. We will get, and you probably find that, they're quite amicable in the beginning, but when things like that happen, they're not so much as the process goes on. So we have that a lot. We'll have clients come to us, say, look, we're looking at separating, going to sell the home, what can I do next? You know, we're amicable, so we're fine. I always still say you need to speak to a family lawyer first, because money comes in, something doesn't quite go to plan, which is very often, really.
Yes, definitely.
So I think, like you said, very early on in that process, no matter how well you're getting along, you still have to get that advice first.
Well, ultimately, it's going to help them decide whether to keep a property, whether they need to sell a property, and how much money they need to, pay out a bank or refinance a loan, or pay out the other person if they're wanting to retain that property and buy something else. So it can impact their future decisions dramatically.
So,
sorry, I was just going to elaborate on that. Quite often, and that's what's great about having Renee in the mix as well, is one of the parties can quite often buy out the other person, and they don't realise that. They come to me first and say, we need to sell, we're out of this. But actually, one of them could still stay in the family home. So consulting the right people, so you have that information up front, because for all you know, you could buy out the other person and you've left the family home and you didn't have to.
Exactly, and it may not be the right time to sell as well.
That's right.
And they often think, no, we've got to sell everything and divide everything 50-50, but that's often not the case. People can look at refinancing and paying the other person out, and then that gives them more time to plan the sale of their property if they're going to sell it down the track. To see someone like yourself, Meg, to kind of manage the preparation of a property for sale, to see someone like yourself, Nicole, to look at the sales process, how long that's going to take, to give them more time to be able to make those informed decisions. Really important.
But that's got to form part of the process, because that's where your division of assets come up. So that's why you still have to see that family lawyer to give that advice on that to work out. It's still going to be fair in your way.
And we still want to get the maximum price for a house. Even though you're getting divorced, you still want to make sure you get that maximum price. We've just had a client literally where the agent's taken on a listing, and this agent and I have been working together. We've worked together quite a few times, and he'd taken on this listing. The divorced couple were trying to sell the property for a period of the last agent. They didn't have any success. The offers were coming in quite lowball for what they were wanting. This particular agent put me in touch with the client. He explained that there was a divorce situation. It was going to be a case of going to both parties. They were very amicable. They both came to the table, and subsequently we sold that house in the first weekend, and they got $25,000 more than the offers and the market was dictating at that time. So it was a really good story.
And that's a lot of money as well when people are separating. There's so many costs to consider, so that really helps.
And that goes back to your disclosing that information up front, because if we don't have that information, we can't work with it.
Yeah, and in that particular situation, I didn't deal necessarily with them any differently to how I'd have dealt with a client that wasn't getting divorced and going through that process. It was exactly the same. It was just good to know that the process sometimes can just take a little bit longer because obviously those two parties have to come to the table and they have to be in agreement with it. Or it might be that, you know, they're paying 50-50. So we're talking about financials instead. And I mean, Nicole, where would we go with something like that when you're dealing with financials and people having to come to the table with X amount of money in that situation when they're selling?
Well, we just form part of that process, I guess. So, Marie, when I guess we say to them, come to you quite early on, what is the actual process? Like, when would you bring myself in there?
Really
to help
early
with the
on,
capacity?
when
What's the actual process when someone would come for you?
it depends on what they're sort of implying that they're wanting to do. So if they say to me, look, I really just want to sell everything, then I quiz them about why. And once I sort of get an understanding as to whether they actually want to retain the property or not, or perhaps they don't think they can, that's when I refer them to someone like yourself, a mortgage broker that can actually sit down with them, work out what their borrowing capacity is. That's the most important thing. And the reason we do that is because we need to obviously enter into negotiations with the other person. And, you know, it's silly to just make an offer and not know if the person's going to be able to comply with that down the track because we formalise those offers. So it's quite important. And so getting that advice about what borrowing capacity they have to establish whether or not they can refinance that property into their sole name. But not only that, often it will involve paying the other person some money. So they'll say to me, oh, I've already offered to pay my ex-partner, you know, 300,000 or 400,000 in exchange for refinancing the property. And I'll say to them, well, have you had advice to confirm that you can actually refinance the existing loan and also that $300,000 to pay to your ex-partner? Oh no, I think the bank will just let me have it. But quite often that's not the case. And I've been involved in situations where the client has said to me, yes, I can definitely borrow. So I've gone along with that. And then they haven't been able to. And then the whole deal falls apart and they end up paying more down the track. So really important to get a mortgage broker like yourself involved to give them that advice so that they can make those informed decisions about whether they should be refinancing and offering to pay the other person some money, or whether financially they should just sell. So it just depends. But it would be good for you, Renee, to just go through the process of what you look for when it comes to refinancing and looking at borrowing capacity and those sorts of things.
What other options are available? Are there any other options? Like,
There's-
just
yeah,
explain
there's
to
so
the
many
listeners
options.
what they are.
It's pretty unlimited, really, depending on the person's situation. And we deal with all walks of life. So there's always two sides of it. So someone thinks, I own majority of my house. I've only got $100,000 owing on it, but I've got, you know, $800,000 in equity.
Yeah.
Surely the bank is going to lend me that. But if you've been a stay-at-home mum for 6 years, you might, after the fact, just be relying on some family tax income. More than likely, you're not still going to have enough income for that. So we really go through all that in pretty in-depth detail with them to give them some pretty good guidance at that stage. Yeah.
I was going to ask you that, sorry, because quite often I also experience that where there's been, the mum's been at home for 20 years, dad's been working, so how do we split this? She doesn't feel she's got enough to, you know, maintain the property, so what are my options really? So it is good to know up front what you can and can't borrow exactly.
And unfortunately, sometimes we just don't have that option, and that's where it comes back to yourself, Marie, just trying to divide those assets up that works out what's best for that partner of the relationship as well, to make sure they're looked after with the family.
Yeah, so I've heard there's such things that you can go to the bank about, like holidays, and you can have breaks from what's that about? What's that where you can
Or like
contact the
financial
bank?
hardship, you mean?
Yeah,
you
like
can't pay?
say for example, the client hasn't decided necessarily to separate, but it's looking likely that might be the case. Are there other options available for that particular seller?
It's a bit more of a temporary solution. So
Okay.
you can, if they pay the loan in advance, or if they are going through some sort of hardship, the bank will be a bit more lenient on the repayments there.
So what do you need to do in that instance? Because I've also had that before. Must they go and speak to their bank to get them through the next 6 months, or what should they be doing? Because some people are just unsure, and then they don't do anything, which is sometimes the worst thing
And
to
then
do.
they're in arrears,
Yes,
which
I've had
causes a
that.
lot more problems.
Yes.
So you're best to do, contact your bank straight away, just directly,
Okay.
and just talk to them. Be open, like you said, be honest about the whole situation. So contact the bank directly.
Yeah. Have you guys got any clients that you're working on together at the moment that you are helping out with both of those areas?
We
so
do.
family law to mortgage broker, back and forth.
Yeah, we work quite well together, Renee and I, which is awesome, because working as a team in this situation is so much easier for me as a family lawyer, because I can just pick up the phone and say, Renee, the client said that, she's called you and she's waiting on, advice about her borrowing capacity, where is it at? And then you'll explain to me directly exactly what the process is, and that you're waiting on documents from her. So then I can call her and say, Renee said that she's waiting on your latest credit card statement, and once she has that, then she can, process your application. And so it's easy for me to just call you direct rather than waiting for this client, and that can cause the client distress. So that really does help us work together.
So it is quite an emotional journey for them. It's quite upsetting. So they don't always understand the whole process, and that it does take time. And ultimately, we try and find a solution for them. So it's not going to happen on that day always. It can take time. So, it's just good that we can communicate directly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Renee, you've asked me for documents
Yeah.
from the client, so I'll help you
Yeah.
with that, and that kind of moves the process
Yeah.
along.
So what's a typical situation or circumstance that someone would come to you if we're telling our listeners that you need to speak to a mortgage broker to talk to them about possibly financing? What sort of things do they need to bring to the table, like in that instance? What would you need from them? What can we advise them that could help them with the process with you?
Well, firstly, hopefully it's after they've spoken to their family lawyer and are sure that's the right decision for them to do. But we would do it as any client. So we'd still assess all their income details, all their expenses, and what their living situation is going to be once they take over that property themselves. So in their new situations. Yeah.
That's why planning that new
Yeah.
situation is so important, because Renee needs that information. Whereas if you haven't had that advice from the family lawyer and you go straight to Renee and say, I want to borrow $300,000 to pay out my ex and I want to refinance this loan, Renee's not across all of that. Whereas if we're working together as a team, I can tell her what the strategy is so that she can help the client the best way.
But clients, because they do come directly to us sometimes, they don't realise if they do actually formalise a separation, it takes away from stamp duty and government charges that may be due. So they actually think that it's just the easiest way to just come directly. It's all amicable. We're going to sort it out ourselves, but they can actually
what do you
save
mean?
themselves.
I've never heard that before. What do you mean
so
they
Maria
exclude
probably-
them
they
from?
finalise.
So so they both own a property, so it's in joint names or
Yes.
it's in one person's name, and the ownership is changing from joint to one or from one to the other. It is actually treated as a sale and a purchase, so you would pay stamp duty as though you were a traditional purchaser-seller.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Yeah,
whereas
so you
if
keep calling it a refinance, Meg. It's actually not a refinance. You are actually purchasing the
Yes.
property.
Yeah, right.
You're taking over the
I didn't
share of
think
your
about it like
ex-partner.
that.
Exactly. Yeah. So by formalising
Yeah.
the actual family law agreement between the two of them, that can actually exempt the stamp duty, so that then they don't have to
That's
pay it, and
thousands
it
of dollars.
formalises their agreement. So it's
It
really
is.
beneficial.
Yeah.
I think what's great is if I can go one step back, I've had a recent scenario where I met with both parties. They wanted to sell, they didn't disclose they were divorcing. The husband actually phoned me later on and said to me, look, this is the situation, we actually are separating. And him as the male, which I found was very interesting, he reached out to me and he said, do you have someone who could assist me in possibly the separation or the mediation? And that takes quite a lot for someone to do. So at that point I said, well, actually I do have a group of professionals I work with. I gave Marie's details out and I said, have a chat, because I could see there was a lot of tension between the two of them. She wanted to stay, he wanted to go. And I was able at that point to say, whether you sell or not, this is the person I recommend. Try and sort it out first, see what you're entitled to, because she was actually living in the house, he had left. So he wanted advice from me from the early stages of the transaction, and I was able to refer him early on.
Yeah. So what are the implications in that scenario then with Nicole, that the husband and wife or whatever it might be, one of them's moved out? Does that have any implications? Is that
Well, generally, if you're in the property, you have more control over the sale process.
Yeah.
And generally, you would continue to pay the mortgage because you're living in the property, the other person may be paying rent. So that's sort of how it works, and it just depends on, even though you've got two people's names on a mortgage, you're jointly and severally responsible for that mortgage repayment, and so, you know, whether you're living there or not, the mortgage still needs to be paid.
Recently had a client come out the other side who had just sold their family home, but because she'd moved out, so he had actually put holes in the wall. He wouldn't let potential buyers come through the property when they should have, so they actually had to take a loss, and then they got themselves in quite a bit of trouble, couldn't pay back other facilities they had. So it's taken her about 5 years to actually get on top of everything after that happening. So I know it's obviously, like you say, safety first, but the best situation is if you can both stay there until you actually sort it out.
And just on that, obviously there's, you know, that's a whole big topic in itself when you've got that domestic violence or something like that's going on in the
That's
relationship,
so common these days,
and it's a massive
Prominent
subject.
issue. Yeah.
And can we give our listeners any advice on that?
On domestic violence.
Yeah, so if a person has to move out of the home, you know, they don't have the
always
option to
safety.
stay in there. What would you maybe what
always
advice would you give to them?
Always safety first. So if you are fearful of your own personal safety and your children's personal safety, then you should look to move out and make arrangements to stay somewhere else. And this is where getting that advice before you separate is really important, because family lawyers can give you a strategy to put in place to help you move out, to help you take your personal possessions when you move out. That's really important. Lots of people just flee with, you know, their handbag and their child, and that's it. And they think they'll get all of their, you know, their grandparents', you know, heirlooms or what have you, personal sentimental items back.
Really think about that.
But quite often that doesn't happen. Quite often what you leave, you generally never get back. Sometimes you do, which is great, but I've seen many
So
situations
common not to.
where people clean out the house and you're left with nothing. So it's really important to get that advice early on. There's also domestic violence applications that you can make, either with the police and their assistance, or alternatively you can make a private application, and you just need to visit your local courthouse to do that. And if you're wanting to stay in the property, so say we have mother with children who has no income as they're not working, and there is violence going on, you can actually make a court application asking the court to issue an ouster order. So that means that that order will basically have the other person vacate the property by a certain period of time, and then that will allow you to live in the property primarily until you sort everything out. So that's really worthwhile. So, you know, if any of our listeners are in fear of their safety, then they should take that very seriously. Just because being in the property gives you that control over the sales process, nothing's more important than your safety. That's really good advice. I know that you and I have worked on a project together a little while ago whereby we had two amicable parties living in the house. The only non-amicable thing that was going on was the fact that the husband wanted to spend money on painting the exterior of the property, but the wife was like, I don't think that's where we need to be spending our money. So there was that kind of conflict. It was like about $10,000 or something. So to them it was a lot of money.
Yes.
And it was about making sure that they spent that wisely. So do we just paint the outside walls and then cross our fingers and hope that Nicole can sell our property? Or is it do we get someone in to give us a bit more strategic advice like Meg, and spend our money more wisely? And so what happened in that scenario, Meg, can you recall?
So subsequently I got a call and I went out to see that client. It was slightly awkward in that husband was at the back of the house and wife was at the front of the house, and they were still living together. So but, you know, we managed to get them to the table, and we managed to get across the things that we wanted to recommend to them, and that was really just tidying up the inside of the house. We talked about using paint colours inside and fixing up various things, like worktops had like burnt holes in them. We would replace things like that. Just making sure the house presented much better than it did.
And the facade as well. You did some
we
work out there.
We did some work out in the gardens, because he was on about painting the outside of the house, which we all know is an expensive exercise in itself. But if you're not going to do anything else, you know, we use the paint to make the house look great, but then the gardens and the street appeal still look terrible. So in that case, I just said to him, well, how about we just paint the front of the house? We don't paint all of it, but we just make the street appeal look, you know, much better than it is. So have your gardens done, get the front painted, and do some tidying up of the inside of the house. And what was good about that situation and scenario was I was an outside party giving that couple advice that was strategic, and it was going to help them get to where they both wanted to be, and that was ultimately getting the highest price for their property and being able to move on.
I think that's important to mention, that we're all professionals. This is so common these days. So we're all very sympathetic towards it. We want to help them achieve what they're setting out to do. We want them both to be happy at the end of the day. So we'll work with how we need to with them. You know, they don't have to sit around the same table. They don't. If they can't, unfortunately, talk to each other or stand the side of each other, we will see them both separately. So we really are quite sympathetic towards that and try and just work with them how we need to.
And just on that, I just feel that having a team like this is so important for those kinds of clients or any of our listeners to have around them. Even if you're not in the situation where you're ready to sell or you're going to divorce or you're going to move, make sure you surround yourself by having a broker, an agent, a stylist, a family lawyer, if you ever need one.
But also that those people can work well together. It is much more beneficial to, for example, if you find a real estate agent that you really want and you really like, ask that real estate agent for a recommendation to a mortgage broker that they work with, and then do the same thing with the lawyer and the property stylist, because if everyone in that particular group of professionals can work well together, they're more likely to get an amazing outcome for you, rather than you sourcing your own broker, your own agent, your own, you know, family lawyer, your own stylist. None of them are talking to each other. Communication can break down, and it can really cause problems.
And the other good thing is we all have a doctor that we go and visit on a regular basis. So if something's wrong, we go and see our doctor. We chose that doctor. That doctor is our choice for a reason. There's no
trust them.
That's right. So how about get to know your real estate agent in your area? You might not be ready to sell today, but you're going to be ready to sell maybe some point in the future. So make that relationship and connection with them early on. Surround yourself with people in advance instead of waiting to that stage where you get right to the last minute and you go, oh, I need a mortgage broker. Where do I go? Or who do I ask? You know, we are everyday normal women. We're moms, just like some of our listeners, and we're very approachable. We're always up for a coffee or a wine. So you know, you can come and talk to us, and we can build relationships so that you have those relationships and connections there for when you need them. And hopefully they don't need a family lawyer, and hopefully they don't need to come to you because they're having problems with paying their mortgage. But if they do, we certainly can help them. So in summary to all of that, thank you for listening to episode 4 of Lip Talk. We've certainly enjoyed talking about that difficult subject, divorcing or forced to sell. Hopefully you can listen into our future episodes. And if you want to have a look at our show notes, you can follow us on Instagram and all of the social media channels. So thank you.